Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Investigational New Drug Workshop. This is the first in a two-part series on the best practices for the preparation, submission, and maintenance of sponsor investigator INDs and IDEs. My name is Rachel Johnson. I'm a regulatory affairs scientist within the Office of Regulatory Affairs and Quality at Duke. Today's workshop is going to have two parts. So in the first, we'll talk about IND exemptions and whether your study would require an IND. We're also going to touch on pre-IND meetings, which are opportunities to meet with the FDA in advance of submitting your IND. In the second part of the workshop today, Dr. Katherine Deland is going to talk about the best practices for IND preparation and maintenance. As a note before we get started, continuing education credits for the workshop are going to be mailed to participants after a few days. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. If you have questions throughout today's talk, please use the question and answer function and direct those to the host, which is Daniel Tonkin, not to the presenter. During today's talk, we're going to have some practice questions that you can participate in. So please navigate to the following website on your phone or on your laptop in order to answer those. It's Poll Everywhere, or pollev.com/DukeU. And so you don't need to download anything or register or create an account. You can just go to this site and you'll be able to respond to those practice questions throughout the talk today. And I will show this website again before the first practice question. So note that we are recording the seminar today, and so it may be published online on our website. So if you do ask questions, those would be recorded as well. All right, so let's get started. We'll first go over what the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, is and go over an introduction to that. The FDA is the government agency that's tasked with overseeing clinical trials with investigational drugs and protecting public health. And so one of the ways that they do this is by ensuring the safety and efficacy of medical products like pharmaceuticals and medical devices. They want to make sure that these products are sufficiently safe and effective before they allow them to go to market. They also are responsible for advancing public health, so they aren't meant to be a barrier to innovation, but instead to help move innovative medical products forward in a safe way. So relevant to today's talk, within the FDA, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or CDER, oversees clinical investigations involving drugs. And the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, or CBER, oversees clinical investigations involving biologics. There are some biologics that are overseen by CDER, like certain protein therapeutics and monoclonal antibodies. A regulation is a rule that's issued by a federal agency, and then once finalized, that regulation is published in the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR. So the regulations related to drugs, biologics, and medical devices are written by FDA, and they're published within Title 21 of the CFR. So today we're going to be discussing specifically the regulations that are related to INDs, and these are located in 21 CFR Part 312. So this is an outline of what we're going to go over during part one of the workshop today. We'll start with just going over a few key definitions to get on the same page, and then we're going to jump into IND exemptions and whether your clinical study would require an IND. So to go over that, we'll discuss first what it means for a drug to be lawfully marketed and how that affects your need for an IND. We'll talk about what drug labeling is and what it means for a drug to be used on label or off label. And then we're going to look at the specific criteria for whether a study could be IND exempt and review some guidance that FDA has in this area. And then we'll discuss the process for going to FDA to seek an IND exemption and go over some specific cases where the applicability of these IND regulations might not be as obvious. We'll end the discussion on IND exemptions by going over some case scenarios where we can test our knowledge on the topics that we discussed. And then at the end, we'll just touch briefly on pre-IND meetings, including when you might want to have these meetings with the FDA and the process for doing so. All right, so for the definitions, first we'll go over what is a drug. So the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or FD&C Act, is the main set of laws that gives FDA the authority to oversee drugs. And so this act defines a drug as an article intended for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man or other animals. And there are two parts to the definition. The second part is that it could be a substance other than food that's intended to affect the structure or any function of the body. So this second part means that the drug's not limited to compounds intended for a therapeutic purpose. It could also include compounds intended to affect the structure or function. without regard to whether you want to influence a disease process. So this definition would include compounds administered to blunt or provoke a physiological response or to study a mechanism of action or metabolism of a drug. So for example, something like administering histamine to study the physiological response, even if you don't intend to treat the subject, would fall within this definition of a drug. Next definition, what is an investigational drug? So again, this has two parts. The first, it could be an article that is not lawfully marketed in the US as a drug. And we're going to talk more about what lawfully marketed means in a few slides. An investigational drug could also be an article that is lawfully marketed in the US as a drug, but you're not using it according to how FDA approved it to be used. So you're not using it according to the approved label. So a drug gets approved to be used in a very specific way. And so if you're conducting a study that uses the drug in a way that differs from how FDA approved it, meaning not according to its approved label, that would also be considered investigational. And this could include a new combination of approved drugs as well. So within the scope of medical practice, a physician can prescribe a legally marketed drug for use that's not approved by the FDA. And that's because it involves the use of an individual patient where the primary intent is to treat the patient. And so they'd be able to do this without prior regulatory approval. However, if you're doing a clinical investigation and you're performing that to study an approved drug in a way that's not consistent with the approved label, then the drug would be considered investigational drug. So if your physician is collecting data and administering the product per a clinical protocol, the drug becomes an investigational drug. So what is a clinical investigation? The Code of Federal Regulations define this as an experiment in which a drug is administered or dispensed to or used involving one or more human subjects. For the purposes of the IND regulations, an experiment is any use of a drug, whether approved or unapproved, except for the use of a marketed drug in the course of medical practice. So generally, a clinical investigation is something that's done for research purposes, and you're trying to contribute to generalizable knowledge about the drug. So for our last definition, what is an investigational new drug application or IND? So this is a regulatory submission that you make to the FDA to permit a clinical investigation of a drug. Once you have an effective IND, you'd be allowed to administer that investigational drug for use in a clinical investigation. And so the term drug, when we're using it today, generally refers to both drugs and biologics. So biologics would fall under that definition of drug within the FD&C Act. And so the IND regulations would apply. So current federal law requires that a drug be the subject of an approved marketing application before you can transport it or distribute it across state lines. So an IND, having authorization on our IND must also be secured before you can ship a new drug across state lines if it's not a lawfully marketed drug for the purpose of your clinical study. It's important to note that not all clinical investigations using investigational drugs are going to require an IND. So a study could be exempt from requiring an IND. And today we're going to go over the specific criteria that must be met for a study to be exempt. All right, now that we've gone through the definitions, let's talk more about IND exemptions and discuss what it means for a product to be lawfully marketed. So what are lawfully marketed drugs? These are articles that are commercially available and legally marketed in the US as drugs. So there's a few key things there. You know, it has to be in the US, not in another country, Europe or Canada, anywhere else. And they need to be marketed as a drug, not as something else like a dietary supplement. And so not all commercially available drugs are legally marketed. So that's important to remember. Typically saying something's lawfully marketed is synonymous with saying it's been approved by the FDA, it's an FDA approved drug. But there are some exceptions, reasons why this is not that straightforward. So drugs could be marketed over the counter through a drug monograph, and so those would be considered lawfully marketed, but didn't undergo a formal FDA approval process. In addition, there are some products that were legally marketed before the passage of certain laws in 1938 and 1962, and those are grandfathered in. But if you were making like a homemade version of a legally marketed drug, that is something that would not be considered lawfully marketed. So it has to be the version of the drug that was approved by FDA. So if you're unsure of the marketing status of a drug that you are using in a clinical investigation or planning to use, you can contact us at ORAC or your respective local regulatory office, and we can advise you on how to get that final clarification on the marketing status of the product. It's important to note that approval for marketing a drug is in a very specific manner, and that's defined by the drug labeling. And that drug labeling is really based on data that was submitted by the sponsor to FDA to support the approval of that drug. So we're going to jump into some practice questions now. So as I said earlier, you can go to the pollev.com/DukeU to answer these practice questions. You're not going to need to register or create an account or anything. Just go to this website and you'll be able to participate. I'll give you a minute now to pull that up. So our first question is, what would be included in the definition of a drug within the meaning of the FD&C Act? A, a genetically modified cellular product used to treat a clotting disorder. B, a small molecule inhibitor used to treat breast cancer. C, ragweed extract used in the allergy prick test. Or D, all of the above. Great, it looks like you're all getting this right. It is D. So the first is a biologic product, but we talked about how that would be included within the definition of a drug within the FD&C Act. So the IND regulations would apply to a study using this type of product. For C, the ragweed extract, this might not be intended to treat a disease, but here it is intended to affect the structure or function of the body, so to provoke a physiological response. And so that is going to fall under the definition of a drug. All right, our next question. Which of the following is not a lawfully marketed drug in the US? A, Claritin over-the-counter from Bayer Healthcare. B, Lipitor from Pfizer. C, doxorubicin from Sagent Pharmaceuticals, the generic version. Or D, doxorubicin from Sigma Aldrich, modified in the PI's lab to add a phosphate group to increase solubility. Great, it looks like everyone's doing well on this question as well. The answer is D. So we did talk about how drugs could be legally marketed through over-the-counter monograph, and so A, Claritin here would fall into that category. Maybe wasn't officially approved by FDA through an approval process, but it is legally marketed. For C, the generic version of doxorubicin, that a generic version of a brand name drug would also be considered legally marketed after it undergoes the appropriate approval from the FDA. So for D, there might be a legally marketed version of doxorubicin, but it appears that they might be using one here that is for like a research grade one from Sigma Aldrich, and it's further been chemically modified by the PI to add that phosphate group. So the investigator is not using the legally marketed version of the drug here. Next question, which of the following is not a lawfully marketed drug in the US? Classic clean dandruff shampoo from Head & Shoulders, certified oxygen gas from Airgas, Opdivo or nivolumab from Bristol Myers Squibb, or Hydro Boost hydrating moisturizer from Neutrogena. So this one was a bit trickier, seeing different answers here. For A, the anti-dandruff shampoo is actually considered both a cosmetic and a drug. So the shampoo function of it is a cosmetic. It's intended to cleanse the hair. The anti-dandruff treatment is considered a drug because its intended use is to treat the dandruff. And so that would be considered an over-the-counter drug, but still a drug. For B, the certified oxygen gas, so medical gases like oxygen can be certified for specific indications in the case of oxygen for treating or preventing hypoxia. So if it's designated medical gas that's been certified, it's considered in effect to have an approved marketing application. And for D, the lotion here is a cosmetic intended to moisturize the skin. So that's the correct answer here. D, if you had a sunscreen added to the moisturizer, an SPF to protect against the sun, that could actually be considered a cosmetic and a drug, similar to the dandruff shampoo in example A there. So now we're going to use a flow chart to walk through the decision-making process for determining if a study is going to require an IND. So the first question you ask is whether the test article is legally marketed in the US as a drug. If it's not legally marketed in the US as a drug, the drug is considered investigational, and a clinical investigation with this drug is going to require an IND. Clinical investigations that are using a drug that is lawfully marketed may or may not require an IND, and we're going to talk about this in more detail. This depends partially on how the drug is being used in the clinical investigation. But remember, an investigational drug can either be a product that's not legally marketed or a legally marketed drug that you're using off-label or in a way that the FDA didn't approve it to be used. So let's talk more about that. What is drug labeling and what does it mean to be used on-label or off-label? So labeling defines how a product has been approved to be used by the FDA. So FDA approves drugs to be used in a specific manner, for example, within a certain patient population. And the drug labeling refers to all the printed material that accompanies a drug. So the actual label on the wrapping, and also what we call the package insert, often referred to as the drug label. And this package insert is going to provide information on how the product should be used safely and effectively, how FDA has approved it to be used. So we're going to look at an example of a package insert on the next slide. The two websites that are listed here are searchable databases where you can find the approved drug label. And the first is FDA's website, Drugs at FDA. And here you can find label information for drugs and biologics that are regulated by CDER. The second, DailyMed, contains label information for both drugs and biologics. And it also includes information on the marketing status of those drugs. So that can be helpful if you're trying to determine if the product you're using is lawfully marketed. So as I mentioned, we'll now look at an example of a drug label, and it's going to include things like the indications and usage, the dosage and administration, and contraindications. So here's an example. This is just the first part of the package insert, the highlights of prescribing information. And again, this contains information on exactly how FDA has approved the drug to be used. And all this information is based on data from clinical studies that were used to support the marketing approval of the drug. So the section on indications and usage is referring to the approval of a drug to treat a particular disease or condition. So for example, this drug is indicated for the treatment of Merkel cell carcinoma and locally advanced or metastatic urethral carcinoma. So you can see sometimes the indications for use are a little more specific than just saying a disease or condition. For example, it might be specific that it's approved for those who have had disease progression following a first-line therapy. In some cases, you see that patients must be positive for a certain biomarker. The label also contains information on the approved dosage and administration, the next section there. And so, this is talking about the amount and frequency duration of the dosing. The label will specify the different dosage forms and strengths that are available. And if there are any contraindications for the drug, that's also included in the label. So this could be referring to certain situations where use of the drug would be more risky, it could be potentially harmful, maybe somebody who has kidney problems or something like that. The warning and precautions section will provide information on withholding or discontinuing the treatment in certain cases. And then the adverse reaction section is going to contain a list of side effects of the drug, and these are things that were observed in the clinical trials. So now that we've gone through the drug label, let's talk about on-label and off-label use. So on-label use means that you're using the drug in the exact way that's listed in that package insert. So the same indication, same dose, same route of administration, patient population, same drug formulation, and same drug combination. So if that label mentioned and that drug could be combined with another drug, if it's not mentioned in the label, that would be considered off-label use. So generally, studies involving the on-label use of a drug do not require an IND. One caveat is that as long as the data is not being used in a marketing application or to change the advertising. So typically, studies done by sponsor investigators within an academic research institute, that's not the case. Their goal isn't to try to change the marketing application or change the advertising. So for off-label use, this means any difference from what was approved in the label. So any difference in those different categories that we mentioned. And that could include combination of two drugs that was not mentioned in the label. So FDA doesn't regulate the practice of medicine, so off-label use can be common and allowed in the practice of medicine, and often for certain conditions it could be considered the standard of care. But when you are using a drug off-label in a clinical investigation, FDA oversight would apply. All right, so let's do another practice question. If you could go again to the polleb.com/do. All right, so for this question, an FDA-approved drug, HepX, is approved for intramuscular delivery in persons 18 to 65 years of age who have been exposed to hepatitis C. Of the following uses of the drug in a clinical trial, identify which would be considered on-label. For A, subjects 18 to 65 who have been exposed to hepatitis C will receive intramuscular injections of HepX and will also be treated with Viread, another FDA-approved drug. For B, subjects 18 to 65 who have been exposed to hepatitis C will receive subcutaneous injections of HepX. For C, subjects aged 20 to 40 who have been exposed to hepatitis C will receive intramuscular injections of HepX. D, subjects aged 18 to 65 who have been exposed to hepatitis E will receive intramuscular injections of HepX. Great, the correct answer here is C. So for A, this is off-label because the drug is being given in combination with another drug, and we were not told specifically that the labeling for the drugs mentions the combination. So although they're both FDA approved, it's that combination that can be considered off-label. So for B, the drug is being given via a different route of administration, not intramuscular, but in this case, subcutaneous injection. And for D, the drug is being given to a different patient population. Now it's those who have been exposed to hepatitis E instead of hepatitis C. In C, it is a different age range, the 20 to 40, but this is included or falls within the approved patient population age range. So that would be considered on-label. All right, so let's go back to our flow chart now and walk through the decision-making process for determining if your study requires an IND. We discussed that if you're doing a clinical investigation with a drug that's not legally marketed in the US as a drug, that's going to require an IND. If the drug is legally marketed, the need for an IND depends on whether you're using it on-label or off-label. Generally, studies that use the drug on-label do not require an IND. Again, that one caveat if your goal is to change the marketing application or the advertising. If you're using the drug off-label, it depends. Your study could be exempt of requiring an IND if it meets certain exemption criteria that we're going to go over in more detail. So let's jump into that. The first thing to consider when determining if your study could be considered for an IND exemption, what we call the first hurdle to clear, is asking yourself, is your study using a drug product that's lawfully marketed in the US? If the drug is currently lawfully marketed in the US, then the study is eligible for IND exemption, meaning you could consider whether the IND exemption criteria apply. So keep that in mind when we do some of the case scenarios at the end. And now we're going to go through some of the IND exemption criteria, and these are listed in the Code of Federal Regulations, again, within 21 CFR Part 312. So a clinical investigation of a drug product that is lawfully marketed in the US is exempt from requiring an IND if all 5 criteria are met. The first is the study is not designed to support approval of a new indication or a change in the label. The study is not intended to support a significant change in the advertising of the product. So again, generally, these would be the case if you're conducting a study like sponsor investigator in an academic setting. Often these 2 criteria are met. That is not the goal of their study. But if it's a well-controlled trial conducted by the manufacturer of the drug, often those are their goals. The third IND exemption criteria is often the most challenging to assess, and so we're going to spend time today talking about that. It is that the study does not involve a route of administration, dosage level, patient population, or other factor that significantly increases the risks or decreases the acceptability of the risks associated with use of the drug. The fourth is that the study is conducted in compliance with the IRB and informed consent regulations. So for research involving human subjects, you have to conduct that research in compliance with the IRB and informed consent regulations, regardless of whether an IND is required. So even if your study is IND exempt, you have to follow these, and so that's usually an easy one to meet as well. For 5, the study is conducted in compliance with regulations regarding promotion for investigational drugs. So this is just saying that you are not going to promote the drug as being safe and effective for a certain use when it's not been approved or shown to be so. So talking more about that IND exemption criteria number 3, the risk evaluation, you want to evaluate the risks of your clinical study associated with any off-label use. whether that's the route of administration, dosage level, patient population, drug combination, or drug modification. So you want to assess how the differences in your planned use is different from how it was approved and what the label says. So the FDA has 2 excellent guidance documents that describe IND exemptions and when an IND is required for a study, and so the links are here. The first guidance was written for studies with cancer drugs, but it's also applicable to other types of studies, including those for other serious or life-threatening diseases. But even if you're not studying a serious or life-threatening disease, the guidance gives some insight into how FDA thinks about IND exemptions and their risk-based approach, and gives some examples of cases where you would need an IND versus when you could be exempt. And the second is a more general guidance document talking about determining when your human subject studies can be conducted without an IND. All right, so let's talk a little bit about FDA's guidance in these areas. And if you're kind of using the drug off-label in one of these ways, we'll talk first about route of administration. If the investigator is changing the route of administration from what is in the approved drug label, you want to assess any risks associated with that change. And what FDA says is there could be a significant increase in risk if a marketed drug for oral administration is converted to a dosage form that is to be administered by injection or intravenous, intrathecal, or inhalation routes. And so these other routes of administration could introduce other concerns, maybe things related to sterility or increased local concentration. Maybe it would change how the drug's metabolized, or there could just be other issues that are not present in the oral administration. So that's what you would want to be considering here if you're proposing to use the drug via a different route of administration. Next, the dosage level. When you think about an increased risk with dosage, I think it's common to think, if you're using a higher dose or administering the drug more frequently or for a longer duration, changing that dosing regimen to increase, that would be could potentially be associated with an increased risk. And that's certainly true. The FDA also notes that it's possible that a decrease in the dose could significantly increase risk. And they give the example that administering a low dose of a pure polysaccharide vaccine to study subjects can induce hypoimmunologic or non-immunologic responses in the subjects, and can also induce tolerance to the vaccine, thus making subjects at risk for the infectious disease the vaccine is intended to prevent. So in this example, the lower dose could actually make the product less effective and decrease the benefit potentially. So when an investigator, you'd want to consider, whether any changes to the dose could put the subjects at increased risk, whether that's increasing or decreasing the dose, the frequency, or the duration of administration. Next, the patient population. What FDA says here is that the acceptability of known and unknown risk can vary across different treatment populations. The population chosen for a study could be at an increased risk compared to the approved use population for a variety of reasons, like increased age, different disease or stage of disease, concomitant illness, decreased renal or hepatic function, or concomitant therapy. So for example, a drug that has a lot of toxicity associated with it could be approved for use in a population that has a life-threatening disease. And in that case, the risk of that toxicity may be more acceptable. But if you were proposing to use that drug in a clinical investigation with a population that's not so ill, maybe to evaluate the drug for, say, prevention of that disease, that would prevent a different risk-benefit situation. And so the known risks might not be as acceptable in that patient population. Next, drug combinations. So clinical studies that are involving a new drug combination that's not supported by literature are generally not exempt. So what FDA says is that unless adequately described in literature, initial studies involving new drug combinations should be performed under an IND because of the possible occurrence of synergistic toxicity. And so this could be enhanced effects from combining the drugs. So maybe one of the drugs interferes with the metabolism or elimination of the other agent. So if the synergistic toxicity is likely, animal studies are going to be, you should consider doing those before to determine a safe starting dose for combining those 2 drugs in humans. Next, drug modifications. So the exemption provision was not intended to require only use of the marketed drug. Sponsor investigators can make low-risk modifications to the lawfully marketed drug and still be eligible for the IND exemption. So some examples of low-risk modifications would be over-encapsulating a tablet or changes to the color, scoring, or size of them for blinding purposes. In making modifications to a marketed dosage form, you're going to want to consider the potential risk implications of those modifications. And that could vary depending on what your product is, the type of product, how complex it is. So some changes could be lower risk, like these examples, but others might be higher risk. So if for example, if your product's very sensitive to conditions in the environment, something like a protein, maybe changes could carry greater risk if you're altering the formulation or the dosage form or in any way of manufacturing or how it's packaged. You'd be worried about whether that could change the characteristics of the product. So we do recommend consulting with the FDA about this and providing detailed manufacturing information so that they can determine kind of the risk associated with how you're modifying the FDA approved dosage form. Next, use of a placebo. The regulations say a clinical investigation involving the use of a placebo is exempt if the investigation does not otherwise require submission of an IND. So again, if the study meets those 5 exemption criteria, the use of a placebo alone would not change that. All right, so our next practice question here, do you have to go to the FDA to get an IND exemption? All right, so this one was a bit tricky, seeing some of both answers, yes and no here. So the correct answer is actually no. And so according to FDA, because the assessment of risks involved in a therapeutic procedure is an everyday part of the practice of medicine, the individual investigator should usually be able to determine the applicability of the exemption. So this statement's found in both of those FDA guidance documents. And so what they're saying is that the investigator should be able to make that initial risk determination to see if they feel the risks of the subjects are significantly increased or the acceptability of the risks is decreased. And so the investigator can make that assessment and actually submit the rationale for why they feel the study is IND exempt directly to the IRB or the Institutional Review Board. And so you're going to want to include this rationale in the form, either a checklist or narrative statement. You want to check your local IRB policies and make sure you're following those and providing that in the format that they expect. And if the IRB agrees with you, you're able to proceed with your study with just IRB oversight. So they would be able to get that IND exemption if they assess that your study meets the criteria. If the IRB does not agree with you, you could go to FDA at that time to request the IND exemption. However, there are other reasons you would want to go to the FDA first to seek an IND exemption before submitting your study to the IRB. Some reasons you might want to do this are time constraints. So you might have some constraints on when the study needs to begin. And if you go to the IRB first thinking you won't need an IND, you feel like you meet those exemption criteria, and then during the review process they disagree with you or feel like you need to go to the FDA to determine that could potentially delay the start of your study. And so maybe it's beneficial to seek feedback from FDA early in that process. It could also be that you have an industry partner for your study and they've requested that you get FDA input before they're going to donate the drug or release funding for the study. It might also be that the situation is just unclear from the start. It's not straightforward whether the risks are increased or acceptability of the risks are decreased in the way that you're using that marketed drug off label. And so you want FDA to weigh in on that because it's not clear. You may require documentation from the FDA for a grant, or it could be that your local policy requires FDA input. That's not the case here at Duke, but you'd want to check your local policies and see if that's required. So if you do go to FDA to have them evaluate the study, they're going to focus on those same things we've been discussing, assessing the risks of your study by focusing on how you're using the drug off label, the patient population, route of administration, dose, whether it's combined with another drug, and if you've modified the drug. So let's talk a little bit more about that review process and how you would reach out to the FDA to determine if the study needs an IND. So there are 2 different processes that can be used, the formal and informal process. So for the formal process, you're basically making an IND submission to the FDA. And so the benefit here is you're on a 30-day review clock. That's how long FDA has to review INDs. And so you're going to know by the end of that time whether you're exempt or not. And if you are exempt, you're going to receive an official letter of IND exemption from the FDA, so that can be helpful for your records. If not exempt, you're going to have an active IND. So you basically have compiled all that's required. And so, by the end of that 30 days, you should be set either way in terms of either having that exemption or ideally having an active IND. In the informal process, you would contact the appropriate review division at FDA and ask them to consider whether you're IND exempt. And so potentially this could be less work up front. We say potentially because it is possible that if they determine that you do need to submit an IND, you would still have to go through that formal submission of an IND. You might get a faster response, so it could be less than the 30-day review. And their response might come in either writing or a verbal, like a phone call. So for this formal process for obtaining the IND exemption, what does this look like? And so the submission is going to contain a cover letter, and we'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. And then it will contain the full IND itself. And so in part 2 of the workshop today, Katherine's going to talk in more detail about what goes into an IND and what the format of that is. But you'll include the IND document, your clinical protocol, your consent form, and 3 different FDA forms, the 1571, 1572, and 3674. If applicable, you would include a letter of authorization. And you might include reprints from the literature, so about 2 to 3 references. And so these would be things that would support the fact that your study could be IND exempt. So maybe you'd be including literature references that show prior human experience with the drug in the way or relevant ways to how you're proposing to use it in your study. So for that cover letter, you're going to want to state in the first paragraph that you believe the study may be exempt. To kind of spell it out for FDA, you'd restate the 5 exemption criteria and then outline how and why you feel you meet them, really focusing on the exemption criteria number 3 about why you don't feel the risk of the study subjects is increased with that off-label use, so focus on safety. There is a link here to some template documents that are helpful for this submission. For the informal process for obtaining the exemption, you would call or email the appropriate FDA review division for your product and explain the situation and ask if they'll consider reviewing the study. You're going to need to provide them information about your plan so they can make this assessment, so something like the protocol synopsis or the full protocol for review and any other requested information. So different divisions may have different forms or other required documents that you would need to submit. You should receive the FDA determination within about 2 weeks, and you can ask the FDA if they're going to provide a formal letter, an email, or just a verbal response. It's possible FDA could come back and ask for, to provide more information or say that your inquiry is a complex question and you're going to need to submit that formally to them. For this informal process, you would want to reach out again to the appropriate review division. And so how do you determine what that is? If you're studying a drug, you're going to reach out to CDER, and the review division is broken down in CDER by the therapeutic area that you are studying. And so this link will take you to the contact information for CDER. If you're studying a biologic and you're going to CBER, they're organized by the type of product that you're studying, and you're going to want to contact the lead regulatory project manager in the appropriate office. And there's a link there to get you to that contact information. Okay, so let's do another practice question.
Hey, Rachel, before you move on, I wanted to jump in with a question a person had. It was just about whether a product with an EUA is considered a lawfully marketed drug when making these considerations. So like a drug that has an EUA for COVID, a vaccine, or treatment. And this is basically the answer, I think, is it's not lawfully marketed, but it wasn't totally obvious, but we discussed this in our office, and in communication with the FDA, it did seem that you cannot get an IND exemption for a drug that has an EUA. It has to have a full approval. So just wanted to point that out.
Great, thank you, Daniel. So for the practice question, in which of the following scenarios can you proceed with your study? A, you first go to the FDA and they deem the study IND exempt. B, the investigator determines that the study meets the IND exemption criteria. Or C, the FDA determines the study is exempt and an IRB approves the study. It looks like a lot of you are getting this one right. The correct answer is C. So you do require IRB approval for a study. before you can initiate it. And so that's kind of what distinguishes A and C here. And if your investigator determines that the study meets the IND exemption criteria, you would still need to submit that to the IRB with your rationale for why you feel you meet those exemption criteria and get IRB approval before initiating the study. All right, so now we're going to talk about some specific issues or special cases where often, they raise questions for investigators when it comes to determining if these IND regulations apply. And so it just might not be as obvious for some of these cases whether you need an IND or not. So we're just going to go over how the IND regulations apply to studies using these products, and then also talk about briefly research that has non-commercial intent. So to start with, endogenous compounds, these are compounds that are found naturally in the body. And so they're often used in challenge studies to evoke a physiological response or characterize a disease or establish a mechanism of action. So although there's not an intent in some of these studies to treat or mitigate a disease, there is an intent to affect the structure or function of the body. So these types of studies would require an IND unless they're otherwise exempt. If you remember that definition of a drug that we went over at the beginning, the second part of that includes substances intended to affect the structure or any function of the body, not just those for therapeutic purposes. Next, live organisms. Again, challenge studies with live organisms like viruses, bacteria, or fungi are often done to administer to study pathogenesis of a disease or host response, and these are going to require INDs, again, unless otherwise exempt. And similar rationale, there might not be a therapeutic purpose, but there is an intent to affect the structure or function of the body. And so this would apply whether the live organism is wild type or if you've modified it in some way, the organism is considered a biological product. Next up, dietary supplements. And these are defined as products taken by mouth that are intended to supplement the diet and contain a dietary ingredient. And examples of dietary supplements are things like vitamins, minerals, herbs, and botanicals, amino acids, metabolites, including extracts or combinations of these things. So you'll find these in like tablets or capsules, soft gels, liquids, or powders. They come in lots of forms. And the need for an IND when you're doing a study with a dietary supplement is determined by the intent or objectives of your study. If you're studying the structure or function effects, you do not require an IND. So some examples of this would be studying the effect of the dietary supplement calcium on bone mass, or studying the effect of fiber on bowel regularity. These are seen as structure function studies, and an IND would not be required. However, if you're studying the effect of the dietary supplement in a therapeutic study, to see if it could diagnose, cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent a disease, an IND would be required unless you're otherwise exempt. So some examples of this would be studying the effect of calcium now on osteoporosis prevention, so a disease, or studying the effect of fiber to treat diarrhea. So again, the idea here is that the objectives of your study would determine kind of whether you need an IND or not in this case. Next, radioactive isotopes. So radioactive isotopes are sometimes used in studies to obtain basic information about drug metabolism or about human physiology, pathophysiology, or biochemistry. So sometimes these studies are not intended for a therapeutic purpose or to diagnose something. And so radioactive drugs that used for this certain research can be done without an IND in cases where they're generally recognized as safe and effective. And so in order for these studies to be done without an IND, it needs to be basic research only, so not intended for the therapeutic purpose or to diagnose something. You'd be using at a dose that does not cause any clinically detectable pharmacological effect in humans, and you're going to want to minimize the total amount of radiation to the smallest radiation dose practical to perform the study. And these studies would be overseen by a Radioactive Drug Research Committee, or RDRC, which itself is approved by the FDA. So these regulations apply to the radioactive versions of both approved or unapproved drugs. And there's no specific regulation for cold or stable isotopes, but what FDA says is that because the risks involved with cold isotopes are generally lower than the radioactive isotopes, FDA does not require an IND for studies using cold isotopes that meet these criteria. Next, research with non-commercial intent. The IND regulations apply to investigations regardless of if the intent of your study is commercial or non-commercial. So if it's simply for research, a lot of times investigators think that if they're not planning to market the drug in the future, that they're just doing research, they don't require an IND. But the IND regulations do apply to the clinical studies regardless of whether the intent is commercial or not. So what about cells and human tissue? So human cells, tissues, or cellular or tissue-based products, which we'll call HTTPs, this is referring to articles containing or consisting of human cells or tissues that are intended for implantation, transplantation, infusion, or transfer into a human recipient. So HTTPs are not marketed as drugs, but they are used to treat patients. So what does this mean if you want to do a research study with something that is an HTTP? Well, first let's talk about what is considered an HTTP. So the following articles are not considered HTTPs, and so in most cases, research with these would not require an IND. Something like a vascularized human organ for transplantation, whole blood or blood components or blood derivative products, secreted or extracted human products like milk, collagen, or cell factors, minimally manipulated bone marrow for homologous use that's not combined with another article, cells, tissue, or organs that are from other animals, not humans, or blood vessels that are recovered with organs for use in the organ transplantation. Some things that are examples of HTTPs would be things like bone, ligaments, tendons, cartilage, skin, arteries and veins, heart valves, or hematopoietic stem cells. And there's some additional examples here. So when would these type of products need an IND? So the HTTPs can be regulated solely under Section 361 of the PHS Act, which basically means that you do not need an IND for the study if they meet all of these 4 criteria. So the first is that they need to be minimally manipulated. The second is that they're intended for homologous use only. And we're going to talk about these 2 criteria a little more on the next slide. For 3, the manufacture of the HTTP does not involve the combination of the cells or tissues with another article except for water, crystalloids, or sterilizing, preserving, or storage agent. And then either the HTTP does not have a systemic effect and is not dependent upon the metabolic activity of living cells for its primary function, or if it does have a systemic effect or is dependent on metabolic activity, it either needs to be for autologous use, so in the same patient, for allogeneic use in a 1st degree or 2nd degree blood relative, or for reproductive use. So let's talk about the first 2 criteria a little more. There are 2 definitions of minimal manipulation, one that applies to structural tissue and one that applies to cells or non-structural tissue. But they're both focused on whether you are altering the properties of the tissue that contribute to its function. So processing that alters the original characteristics of it could raise increased safety and effectiveness concerns. You just less basis on which to predict how that product's going to function after it's transplanted. So if you're for structural tissue, if you're altering relevant characteristics of the tissue for reconstruction, repair, or replacement. For non-structural tissues, if it's changing something like the differentiation status or proliferation potential. What does it mean to be intended for homologous use? This means that you intend for the HTTP to have the same basic function in the recipient as the donor. And again, if that's the case, there's reasonably could be expected to function appropriately in the donor, but if it's being used for a different use, you might not be able to as easily predict if it's going to behave appropriately. So it might be raise increased concerns about the safety or effectiveness of that use, and that would be better to be seen under the study under an IND. All right, so next let's go through some different case scenarios. So pull everywhere again. And for each of these case scenarios, we're going to go through a few different questions. So is this study eligible for IND exemption? What is off-label about this case scenario? And you could select more than one answer for these questions. And then last, what kind of documentation would you provide to the IRB or FDA? For scenario 1, an investigator plans to treat lung cancer patients with 3 doses of the checkpoint inhibitor zizumab, 2 days apart at the dose indicated in the package insert, prior to tumor resection. After tumor resection, the investigator will examine changes in immune infiltrates in the tumor. Zizumab is FDA approved for weekly use in patients with lung cancer after resection. Zizumab will be used at the approved dose. So our first question is, can this study be considered for an IND exemption? So this was a bit of a tricky question. We're seeing both answers here. What we're asking is, is this, could it kind of clear that first hurdle that we talked about? Is this study using a legally marketed drug where you could consider whether the IND exemption criteria apply? So in this case, it can be considered for an IND exemption because we were told Zizumab is an FDA-approved drug. Next question, what is off-label in this case scenario? The route of administration, the patient population, new drug combination, the dose, or a drug modification? Great, so I see a lot of you are selecting dose, and that is true. So they told us that the drug is going to be given 2 days apart versus how it was approved to be given weekly. So that's a different dosing regimen. It's also the case that the patient population could be considered off-label in this use because we were told that the drug's now going to be given prior to the tumor resection versus after, which is what it was approved for. So it could be considered a different patient population. So those would be two things that could be off-label in this use. If you're doing a study with this, what kind of documentation would you want to provide to the IRB or FDA in support of an IND exemption? Well, you'd want to provide some safety data talking about this dose frequency of administering it every 2 days instead of weekly, either in this or other patient populations. If there's any data available about the use of Zizumab before a resection, you'd want to provide that as well. Any rationale for, that is low risk for short-term Zizumab before resection, that it wouldn't, carry a risk for that surgery. All right, our next scenario, an investigator plans to conduct a trial to assess the effectiveness of a commercially available probiotic to treat chronic fatigue. The probiotic will be used at the daily dose recommended on the packaging. Can this study be considered for an IND exemption? So the answer here is no. The study is not using a probiotic that is legally marketed as a drug. And remember, that's the first hurdle that has to be cleared. It could be legally marketed in this case as a dietary supplement, but that's different than being legally marketed as a drug. And when you're using a dietary supplement in a clinical study, the need for an IND is determined by intent. If it was a structure function study, no IND would be required. But if it's a therapeutic study, it would require an IND. And in this case, they were looking at the effect that the probiotic had on chronic fatigue. Our next case scenario, an investigator plans a study in which patients with type 2 diabetes will receive both drug A, drug B, or a combination of both. Drug A and drug B are FDA approved for treatment of type 2 diabetes. Both drugs will be used according to their approved dose and route of administration. Neither drug mentions the other drug in their respective package inserts. Can this study be considered for an IND exemption? So here what we're kind of asking is whether it clears that first hurdle. Do we consider whether the IND exemption criteria apply? And so what that is asking is this study using legally marketed drugs? And in both cases here, drug A and drug B are FDA approved and are legally marketed. So we could consider whether the IND exemption criteria apply. What is off-label about the use of drug A and drug B in this case scenario? Right, looks like you guys are all getting this one right. So it's a new drug combination. We were told that the use of drug A and drug B together, neither of those are mentioned in the respective package inserts. So it is an off-label use through that drug combination. And what kind of documentation would you want to provide to the IRB or FDA in support of an IND exemption? You're going to want to provide any previous data evaluating the combination of these two drugs in humans and or in animal models. And so because this is a new drug combination, you're most likely going to need to provide this published data in order for this to be exempt. You also want to discuss whether the drugs affect the same metabolic pathway and whether the risk profiles overlap. All right, for our last scenario, that's an HCTP product. So in this study, an investigator plans to use peripheral blood stem cells to treat Parkinson's disease based on animal data that indicates that PBSCs can induce repair of neurologic tissue. The PBSCs will be collected from a related donor and infused into the subject on the same day. Are the PBMCs minimally manipulated? So yes, it does seem like they are minimally manipulated. We weren't told a lot of details, but we were told that they were infused on the same day. So that does seem to be the case, that they're minimally manipulated. The next question, is the use of the PBSCs homologous use? Correct. Looks like you're getting the right answer here, is no. So this is not considered homologous use because there's insufficient evidence to support that this repair of neurologic tissue is a basic function of these cells in the donor. So the basic function would usually be something like forming or replenishing blood cells. And so I did want to point out FDA has a really helpful guidance about regulatory considerations for HCTP products. I'm talking more about this minimal manipulation and homologous use, and there's a link there. So this next question, would this study require an IND? Right, looks like you're getting this one. Because it's not homologous use, you're going to require an IND for this study. So are there any questions on IND exemptions before we jump into the pre-IND meetings?
I think we're tight on time and have been trying to answer them, so you can go on.
Okay, great. Thank you, Daniel. All right, so we'll end with talking about pre-IND meetings and when you would want to formally meet with the FDA and get their advice on your specific study prior to submitting your IND. So this can be a helpful opportunity to take advantage of if you have specific questions for the agency. And so we spent a lot of time focused on kind of the right side of this flowchart. When are you going to need an IND for your clinical study? But if you haven't, if you're following on the left side here and you know you're going to require an IND, or if you, you're using the drug off label and in a vulnerable population and you have some questions about your study, this would be a good opportunity to have a pre-IND meeting with the FDA. So this is a chance to meet with the FDA and get a sense of what they're going to expect to see in your IND application before you submit it. It's a method to receive feedback from them on your plans for manufacturing the drug, conducting preclinical studies, and your clinical study design. It can help prevent issues during the review of the initial IND. It's most advantageous when you're using a non-FDA approved drug and you control the manufacturing, but it could also be useful in other circumstances. Again, if you, let's say, wanted feedback on your clinical study design. It is best to have this pre-IND meeting before you make any major manufacturing or preclinical decisions. So things that can be quite costly to get FDA input and make sure you're doing those things appropriately before spending those resources. You do only get one pre-IND meeting typically per IND application, and so you want to keep that in mind when you strategize about the best time to have that meeting so you can get your questions addressed. This goes through the process for the pre-IND meeting request. It begins when you submit a meeting request to the appropriate FDA review division, and that's going to contain a draft list of questions for FDA, and so you are dictating kind of the topics that you want to talk about in the meeting based on these questions you submit, and you want to come up with specific, well-defined questions for FDA to have that successful meeting. In that meeting request, you'll say your requested meeting type, so that could be in-person, teleconference, or written responses only. Of course, in-person is affected right now with the COVID situation. And so sometimes FDA is going to feel that even if you requested a teleconference, that your questions can be adequately addressed with just written responses. In either case, you're going to get written responses from the FDA about a day to 2 days before the scheduled meeting, and so you can decide whether or not you want to have that meeting based on reviewing those written responses. And so we do often recommend to people to request a teleconference just in case you do need to clarify anything in those written responses. But sometimes FDA will feel, again, like you can address it just through the written responses. So after you submit that meeting request, FDA will determine to grant the meeting, and if not, provide you a reason, and then provide you a date, the list of the date, time, location, and list of FDA participants. The meeting is held about within 60 days from the FDA receipt of your request, and 30 days prior to that, you need to submit a briefing package. And so that's going to contain all the information, relevant information the FDA is going to need to know to answer your questions that you're asking. And so we do recommend that you have that briefing package pretty much complete before you submit the meeting request, because you'll have to submit it within about 30 days. And so there are some template documents that we have that are helpful for this pre-IND meeting process, and there's a link there for those. The pre-IND meeting itself, remember, it is your meeting. They're typically about 60 minutes long, and so you want to make sure you get the most out of it. You're going to start with just briefly introducing everyone, all the attendees, and a brief introduction on your proposed study and your product. So they're already going to have read that briefing package, and so know all that background material. So we recommend keeping this to about 2 minutes. You don't need to do a 30-minute PowerPoint presentation, because you want to focus on kind of the questions and answers and getting FDA responses to those and clarifying things. You can prioritize things you still have questions about. You might have asked FDA a lot of questions and they gave you written responses to them. And for some of them, you feel like you understand their response and you don't need to clarify anything. You can focus on those areas that you still want to discuss. You don't want to hide any concerns you have. You want it to be a productive dialogue. You don't want to present any data that's not included in your briefing package. So maybe FDA's written responses made you think, I just want to convey this one more piece of information to them, but they'll tell you that, they can't analyze that information during the meeting and come to a decision. So they're not, you don't want to kind of provide that last minute data. Everyone on your team should take notes for a debriefing afterwards. It's good to kind of designate 1 to 2 specific people to take those notes. And at the end of the meeting, you want to summarize any major decisions and action items to make sure everyone's in agreement. You'd want to debrief thoroughly with your team immediately following the meeting and document any decisions that were made. And then draft meeting minutes. You can send those to your FDA project manager. They're the ones who are drafting the official meeting minutes, but they may use your minutes to kind of help them with that. And the FDA will provide you with official minutes from the meeting within 30 days. And so for a practice question, in which of these situations would it be appropriate to request a pre-IND meeting with the FDA? You want to know if your proposed manufacturing and release specifications for your product are acceptable to FDA. You want to know if your proposed non-clinical studies will be adequate to support your planned study. You want to know if the eligibility criteria in your proposed clinical protocol are acceptable to FDA, or all of the above. Great, it looks like you're all getting this one. Those would all be cases where it's appropriate to request a pre-IND meeting, and it's appropriate to discuss manufacturing, non-clinical, or clinical plans within those meetings. Next question, when is the best time to request a pre-IND meeting? A, before you've made any major manufacturing or preclinical decisions. B, before you've made any major manufacturing or preclinical decisions and you have a clinical protocol and protocol synopsis. C, after you've conducted your preclinical safety studies. Or D, 1 month before your grant application is due. So the correct answer here is B. So you like we said earlier, you do want to do this before you make major manufacturing or preclinical decisions, because FDA could weigh in on those, and you might need to alter your plans for manufacturing or the design of some of your preclinical studies. And before you spend those resources, it's a great idea to get FDA input. But you do want to have a clinical protocol or protocol synopsis ready, because your clinical plans can influence some of those requirements. And so it's good to have an idea of what you're planning to do clinically in your study. For D, 1 month before your grant application is due wouldn't be the ideal time, because, as I mentioned, the meeting is held within 60 days, so you wouldn't be able to get the FDA feedback in time. Okay, so are there any questions on pre-IND meetings before we move on to part 2 of the workshop?
I haven't seen any more, and I know we're a little behind, so I think we'll just have to move on. Thank you, Rachel.
Great, thanks, Dana.
Okay, so hopefully the slide should be coming up now. Rachel did a wonderful job of explaining when you would need to conduct your study under an IND in part 1 of this workshop. And so in part 2, we'll be focusing more on the actual content that goes into your IND and how you maintain it after it's gone into effect. Okay, so we'll start just by going over some brief definitions. All INDs will have a sponsor, which is the individual, the company, institution, or organization that actually takes responsibility for and initiates the clinical investigation. Importantly, a regulatory sponsor is distinct from the financial sponsor of a study. An investigator is the individual that actually runs the trial. So there's usually one investigator per site. And if the study is conducted by a team of individuals, the investigator is the responsible leader of that team, while the other individuals would be classified as sub-investigators. Additionally, in academia, it is common to have sponsor investigators, where there's a single individual that both initiates and conducts the investigation. So there are two types of INDs that we'll discuss today, commercial and research INDs. At the time of submission, you will need to specify which type of IND you are submitting. The primary distinction between these two types is the end goal of your study. So if your final goal is to obtain marketing approval or to commercialize your product, then you will need to submit a commercial IND. On the other hand, a research IND is more common in academia, and the end goal here is usually something like publication. And research INDs can be sponsored by a number of sources, including the individual investigator, the academic institution, or even a nonprofit. So hopefully you're familiar with Poll Everywhere from part 1 of the workshop. So if you can go to pollev.com/DukeU, we should have some polls that come up. So the first question here is, who is ultimately responsible for monitoring the progress of a clinical study run under an IND? Is it the investigator, the IND sponsor, the IRB, or the institution? So we're getting a couple of different answers here, and we would actually say that the correct answer is B, the IND sponsor. So although the investigator does have some responsibility for monitoring, you can think of it that they are only responsible for the monitoring that would be occurring at that particular location, whereas the sponsor is the one that's ultimately held responsible. And this, of course, becomes more clear if you think about a multi-site trial. So here we'll start talking more about the actual content that goes into your IND and some of the different formats for submission of an IND. So there are two ways that an IND can be submitted to FDA. The first is an electronic submission in Common Technical Document, or ECTD format. ECTD format is required for the submission of commercial INDs and marketing applications. I mentioned that research INDs were more common in academia, and these can be submitted in legacy format, either by simply mailing paper copies to the FDA, or by sending an electronic submission, and this doesn't have to be in CTD format. So most of the time today, I will be focused on the legacy format that's used in research INDs, but very briefly, I did want to add this slide talking about CTD format in case you want to submit a commercial IND. So commercial or CTD format consists of 5 separate modules, and these are often represented as a pyramid. So in the very top of your pyramid, you have module 1, which contains your administrative information. And this will vary by country or regulatory body. In the middle of your pyramid, you have module 2, which is where you would put kind of a general overview of the raw data, a summary of some of the study reports and other information that you're going to be relying on in modules 3 through 5. And then the base of your pyramid, the foundation, is made up of those raw data and study reports, and they're broken into 3 separate modules. Module 3 contains the quality and manufacturing information. Module 4 will have your preclinical study data, including pharmacology and toxicology. And then Module 5 will have your clinical study reports. So as I mentioned, the majority of our time will be spent discussing the traditional IND format, which is used for research INDs. And this is the layout here. So as a best practice, it would be suggested for you to follow this outline for the most efficient review of your application by the FDA. And I also want to point out that we do have templates available for this format on our website, so you can navigate to that URL if you're interested. Just to quickly run through these sections, first you will need to submit Form 1571, which is basically a cover sheet that goes in with every submission to your IND. You'll also have a table of contents, as well as an introductory statement that provides some clarity on the drug and how you're planning on using it in your specific study. Next is the general investigational plan. So this is where you would provide more of the rationale for your study, as well as the general approach for how your study will be conducted. In section 5, you would include the investigator's brochure, which is basically a summary of all of the relevant information about the study drug that an investigator at a particular site would want to know. But I do want to highlight that if you are running a sponsor investigator trial, you are not required to submit an investigator's brochure here. We'll discuss the sections 6 through 10 in more detail over the next few slides, but this will really just contain your clinical protocol, your chemical manufacturing and control information, or CMC data, any non-clinical studies, as well as previous human experience. And then in section 11, you would add a biosimilar user fee cover sheet. This is only required if you're developing a generic form of a biologic. So in many cases, you wouldn't have anything to add here. So we would recommend just leaving the heading in and simply writing not applicable under this heading. And finally, you would add Form 3674. We'll talk about this more later, but basically it's a certification of compliance form. So where do you get all of the information that you need to include in your IND? If you're using a product that has already been FDA approved or is made by an outside company, you should be able to reference some existing information in the sections that are highlighted here. So for example, if the product has been legally marketed, you can reference the drug label for these 4 sections in order to cover the information needed for your IND. If the product is currently being investigated with an existing IND, you can instead provide a letter of authorization to FDA. This letter of authorization is a letter that comes from a drug company, and it states that confidential information in their regulatory filings can be used in support of your submission. So essentially, it allows FDA to reference that technical information and raw data from a pre-existing submission without the company having to disclose that confidential information to you directly. And a copy of this letter will need to be included with your IND submission. So we have another poll everywhere question. For which drug will you most likely need a letter of authorization to support your IND? A lawfully marketed drug that's being used off-label, an unapproved drug made by an outside company, or a drug that you manufactured in your lab? So it seems like this one was a little bit tricky as well. The answer that we were looking for was B, an unapproved drug made by an outside company. So if you were using a lawfully marketed drug, even if you're using it off-label, you will likely be able to pull a lot of the information for your IND from that package insert. However, if you are using a drug that's being made by an outside company, you would really need to rely on their previous filings with FDA for information on, the manufacturing or preclinical studies, for example. So moving on to section 6 of the IND, this is where you would include protocols. So in addition to your clinical protocol, you will also need to provide FDA with an informed consent form, as well as investigator and facilities data. This third piece can really be captured using Form 1572, as well as a CV for the investigator at each clinical site. Next, we will go over the chemistry, manufacturing, and control section. So as we discussed previously, you may be able to simply reference a drug label or a letter of authorization here instead of actually providing the detailed information in this section. However, if you are handling the drug manufacturing yourself, or if you are modifying the drug in any way, then you will be responsible for providing all of the relevant information for these sections. So on our website, we do have an expanded IND template. So in case you do have to provide this CMC information on your own, we have some additional guidance in that IND template. The CMC section is divided into two main parts. First, the drug substance. So that's your active pharmaceutical ingredient and your raw materials. And then the second big category is your drug product. So that is the final product that's actually being administered to the patient. For this CMC section, you will have to provide a lot of information, including a list of all of the manufacturers that are involved, the raw materials that go into your drug, the steps used in the manufacturing process, any information on how the drug is tested throughout that process. And you'll also be providing certificates of analysis to describe the specifications that were used and how your drug met those specifications. Additionally, you'll be including stability information to support that the storage of your drug will be safe throughout the proposed clinical trial. And then additionally, for the drug product, you will also need to provide details of container closure, showing that it's adequate to keep your drug pure and safe. And then lastly, you'll be including an example of the label language. And at minimum, this will need to include a cautionary statement, which lets the user know that this product is only allowed for investigational use. The next section of the IND will contain your non-clinical and your animal data. So again, if you are modifying the drug yourself in any way, then you will be responsible for ensuring that adequate pharmacology and toxicology information is provided to demonstrate that your product is safe enough to go into humans. But the specific studies that you need will really depend on exactly what you are proposing to do in your clinical study. So it will take into account things like the route of administration, the dose you're using, your dosing schedule, as well as the specific patient population. If you're doing a first-in-human study, then generally at bare minimum, you would need to do IND enabling toxicity studies that are conducted under good laboratory practices in order to provide that foundational level of safety data. A full panel of pharmacology and toxicology information will need to be submitted at the time of a marketing application, but this full panel of studies is not required for your IND. And I also want to mention that if your product has not been used, or sorry, has been used before in humans, then you may not need to provide as much of the preclinical pharm and tox studies. Next, we have the previous human experience. And this section is similar to a literature review of all of the clinical data that can be leveraged to support the safety of your study. So you can include information on the same indication, a different indication, or even a different route of administration. If the drug is completely new, then there may not be any previous human data that you can rely on in your application. So in this case, you could consider providing supporting evidence with drugs that are similar to yours. For example, a drug that has a similar mode of action. Importantly, this section can include information from both published sources as well as unpublished data, but you need to make sure that whatever information you're relying on, that data is available for FDA to review. So the last piece that we'll talk about as we consider the content of the IND will be the forms that need to go in at the same time. So there are three main forms that need to be included in your application: Form 1571, 1572, and 3674. Form 1571 is an agreement by the sponsor to follow all applicable FDA regulations. So this form, it essentially acts as a cover sheet, and it's required to go in with every submission to the IND, both that initial submission as well as any future amendments that are submitted. Form 1572 is an agreement by the investigator to conduct the study in accordance with the protocol as well as all applicable regulations. So it's essentially an agreement between the investigator and the sponsor. But even if you are doing a sponsor investigator study, you're still required to submit this form to FDA. And finally, Form 3674, this is your certification of compliance and registration with clinicaltrials.gov. We'll talk about this more on the next slide, but I did want to note that at Duke, Docker is the office that would be able to help you with this registration. And for all of the forms that I've mentioned here today, we did want to encourage you to make sure that you have the right version. These forms do expire and they're updated over time. So the best practice is always to download these forms directly from FDA's website rather than relying on a copy that you have saved on your local drive. So I mentioned that it's important to show that you are in compliance with the clinicaltrials.gov regulations. So FDA wants you to register all applicable clinical trials, or ACTs. And most studies that need an IND will meet this definition. So this includes studies that meet the following 4 criteria. They are interventional, they evaluate an FDA regulated product, they fall under US jurisdiction, and they are in phases 2 through 4. So this does exclude the early phase 1 studies. Even if your trial does not meet this definition of an applicable clinical trial, there are some additional reasons that you may want to consider registering your trial with clinicaltrials.gov. For example, many medical journals are now requiring registration for publication, and this is to ensure compliance with an International Committee of Medical Journal Editors policy. Likewise, if your study has NIH funding, either in part or in whole, then the NIH expects you to be compliant. Now, the deadline for registering your trial with clinicaltrials.gov will really depend on which agency or policy you are trying to comply with here. But before I go over this table in detail, I do want to point out that these timelines are based on the regulations, but your institutional policy for registering a trial could be different. So in many cases, the institutions will have policies that are more strict than this. So definitely check with your institution first. But per the regulations, if you are registering to meet the requirements for an applicable clinical trial, or you have NIH funding, then the deadlines are going to be the same. You would need to register no later than 21 days after that first patient is enrolled. You're going to be required to update the website at least every 12 months. And then lastly, you will be required to report results from your study within 12 months of that primary completion date. If, on the other hand, you are only registering to meet the requirements for publishing, then you must register prior to enrolling even that first patient. And in this case, you aren't required to report the results, you're only encouraged to do so. So at this point, you should have all of the information that you need to put your IND together. So now we'll talk about actually filing your application and the FDA review process. So every submission to the FDA will include a cover letter. Rachel mentioned this as well in part 1. So we do have a template available on our website for a cover letter that you can use, but essentially it's just a letter that tells FDA exactly what's being included in your submission. So in this case, you could write that this is an initial IND. It will also identify both a primary and an alternate contact in case FDA has questions and they want to reach out. And lastly, you can also use this as an opportunity to include any specific questions or comments that you have for FDA. For traditional INDs, our office is in the practice of submitting them as merged PDFs through the electronic submission gateway. But for an eCTD submission, which is what's required for commercial INDs, then instead of having just one merged PDF, you will be submitting several or many separate documents that will be cross-referencing one another. At Duke, study teams may submit INDs on their own, but all submissions must be shared with our office. There's also a requirement for ORAC to review all new INDs before they are submitted. Our office is submitting the INDs electronically, either in full eCTD format or more commonly as non-CTD submissions. And then after the submission, if you're working with our office, we do provide that final merged PDF to the study team. Now, after you successfully submit your IND, the sponsor will receive an acknowledgement letter from the FDA, and this usually occurs within a week or two. This letter will contain the assigned review division, your IND number, a division contact, as well as the official date of receipt. And this official date of receipt is incredibly important because it starts a 30-day clock for FDA to review your IND. So at this point, FDA will start assembling a team of reviewers that is appropriate to the content of your submission. So this will include clinical reviewers, chemists, toxicologists, and so on. And the primary objective in this review period is to ensure that the rights and the safety of study participants are being upheld. So if the FDA review team has questions during this 30-day review period, they will reach out to you, which is why in your cover letter, it's so critical not just to include a primary contact, but also to have an alternative contact. After you submit that IND, the ideal outcome is that your IND would go into effect. And an IND goes into an effect automatically 30 days after the official date of receipt, unless FDA notifies you otherwise. So it's possible that FDA could notify you before the 30-day clock ends, telling you that your study may proceed, but I don't think this is as common. Instead, you would just assume on the 30th day after receipt that this is your effective date. However, as a best practice, our office still recommends that you try to reach out to FDA to confirm that effective date before you actually start your investigation, just so that you can ensure you haven't missed any communication with them. I also want to point out that even after your IND goes into effect, you still will need to obtain IRB approval in order to legally begin your study. So as we've alluded to, it's possible that FDA will have concerns as they're reviewing your application, and so they will contact the sponsor to request additional information in that 30-day review period. So a commitment in writing to provide FDA with the requested information will often prevent a clinical hold from being placed. For example, if FDA asks you for more testing on your drug product and you don't have the time to complete that testing within the 30 days, then it's possible that simply telling FDA that you're going to perform those tests before you begin your investigation will be sufficient for them to not put you in a full clinical hold. You can usually respond to any of their requests for information or their questions using email to the FDA division contact, and then later formally submitting the response to your IND as an amendment. However, if the IND concerns are not resolved fully within that 30-day review period, then FDA will place the study on clinical hold. This happens if FDA thinks that the subjects in your study would be exposed to unreasonable or significant levels of risk. Or another possibility is that the IND application simply doesn't contain enough information to fully assess the risk in your study. So when a clinical hold has been placed, FDA will notify the sponsor of the clinical hold through some rapid means of communication. They will also receive an official letter within 30 days. And this letter from FDA will explicitly state why the clinical hold was placed and exactly what information needs to be provided to FDA in order to get off clinical hold. The sponsor will then need to address the clinical hold comments in writing and submit a complete response to the IND. And when you have that complete response submitted, that will start a new 30-day review clock. The hold can only be lifted when FDA notifies the applicant that the investigation may proceed. So to quickly recap before we move on, when you submit an IND, the FDA will respond with an acknowledgement. They have 30 days to review your submission and request more information. If they're satisfied in that period, there will be no response, or they will tell you that your study may proceed. Alternatively, if they are not satisfied at the end of the 30-day review, then the study will be placed on either a complete or a partial clinical hold. In the case of a partial clinical hold, part of your study may be allowed to proceed. For example, you may be permitted to enroll a small subset of patients that's much smaller than what you initially proposed. But to resolve this clinical hold, the sponsor must put together a complete response, and that will start another 30-day clock for FDA to review. So you can open back up Poll Everywhere. We have another question here. So this one says the FDA requests additional manufacturing information before the 30-day IND review is complete. What is the best solution? Do you respond quickly to provide this information during the 30-day review period? Commit to providing this information after the 30-day review? Withdraw the IND and resubmit when the information is available? Or wait to be put on clinical hold while you gather this information? So it looks like most everyone is answering A. There really isn't a right answer here. A would really be the best option, assuming this is feasible for you and your study, but it really just depends on the situation. So if you need more time than 30 days to effectively answer their request, it's okay to commit to providing this information after the 30 days. And even C and D are not necessarily wrong depending on your situation. So in academia, especially, it's okay to be put on a clinical hold, especially considering at that point, FDA will provide you with a detailed letter that gives you all of the exact information you will need to go back with in order to get off clinical hold. So we'll be switching gears a little bit at this point from the actual content that goes into your IND and the submission process into the steps that will need to be taken to maintain your IND after it's in effect. So as we've discussed before, Form 1571 is going to be included with every submission that you make to the IND. So this is a screenshot from box 11 on this form. And in this place, you can indicate exactly what is being contained in your submission. So in terms of IND maintenance, there are really 4 categories that you are going to be relying on: annual reporting, protocol amendments, information amendments, as well as IND safety reports. So an annual report is due 60 days after the anniversary of the IND effective date. There's quite a bit of information that goes into the annual report. You will be providing individual study information such as updates on enrollment to the study. You'll also provide summary information, which includes updates on clinical and non-clinical investigations, any manufacturing changes that have been made, as well as a summary of the adverse events that have been reported during the previous year. You will also provide an update to the general investigational plan, which will contain your plans for the upcoming year of the study. And if there have been changes to your investigator's brochure or your protocol, then you can submit those at this time as well. FDA also wants to know if there have been any updates in foreign marketing. So if your drug product has been approved or withdrawn, for example, in another country, then you should include that here. And you can also use this as an opportunity to log any outstanding business with FDA. So if there has been a request by the sponsor for which they're expecting a reply, a comment from FDA, or even a meeting with FDA, you can include that here. So the next aspect of IND maintenance that we'll discuss is protocol amendments. So after an IND has gone into into effect, the sponsor is going to be required to amend the IND to ensure that the clinical investigation is conducted in accordance with the protocol. These protocol amendments may be implemented immediately after submission to the FDA and following review and approval by your IRB. You can submit the amendment to the FDA and the IRB in either order. However, we do recommend that if you are making significant protocol changes, you would be encouraged to wait at least 30 days before you implement those changes, just to give FDA time to review and make sure they don't have any concerns with your new protocol. Protocol amendments are reviewed by FDA upon receipt. However, they don't normally respond unless they have concerns. However, if the sponsor desires FDA to comment on something or to answer a specific question, then you can include those questions in the cover letter that goes in with your submission of the protocol amendment. Now, if we look back at Form 1571, you will see that there are several different types of protocol amendments that can be submitted to your IND. For example, new protocols, changes in protocols, new investigators, post-marketing requirements and commitments, as well as human factor protocols. And we'll discuss a few of these in more detail. So first, a new protocol amendment. An IND can contain multiple protocols. So if a sponsor intends to conduct a study that is not currently covered by a protocol in the IND, then the sponsor would need to submit to FDA a protocol amendment with that new protocol. Additionally, the amendment should include a brief description of the clinically significant differences between that new protocol and any previous protocols in the IND. There may also be changes to your protocol over the course of clinical development. So the IND sponsor would be expected to submit, at the bare minimum, any changes that significantly affect the safety of the subjects, the scope of the investigation, or the scientific quality of the study. So these are the requirements as they're laid out in the regulations, but our office finds it to be best practice to just submit all changes to the protocol, regardless of how significant they are. That way you can ensure that the protocol contained in the IND remains up to date and accurate at any point in time. When you submit this amendment, you should also include a brief description of the change to the protocol, and you should reference by date and serial number the submission containing the original protocol. Please note that in an emergency situation, a protocol change can be implemented before notifying FDA, assuming that the change is intended to eliminate an immediate hazard to the human subjects and that it can be implemented immediately. FDA must subsequently be notified by a change in protocol amendment, and the reviewing IRB must also be notified of this emergency change. So the last type of protocol amendment that we'll discuss here involves new investigators. So the IND sponsor is required to submit a protocol amendment anytime a new investigator is added to carry out a previously submitted protocol. So this will occur, for example, when a new site is activated in a multi-site study, but it could also occur in a single site study if there has been a change in investigator for some reason. This submission should include the investigator information and qualifications of that investigator to conduct the investigation. So as we discussed previously, this is most often provided to the FDA in the form of the investigator CV as well as Form 1572. And FDA should be notified within 30 days of the new investigator being added to the study. So I believe we have a couple more poll questions here. So first, we have a clinical protocol amendment being submitted to the IND. When can changes to the study be implemented? After 30 days, once the FDA responds and allows the amendment to proceed, after IRB approval, or after submission to the IRB. So it looks like most everyone is getting this correct. I would agree that the answer is C. So remember, after you submit a protocol amendment to FDA, you don't have to wait this change can be implemented immediately. So the only thing you're really waiting for here is the IRB approval. But in which situation would it be most important to give FDA sufficient time to review that protocol amendment before putting it into place? And this is assuming that it has already been IRB approved. So some of the examples that we list here would be altered inclusion exclusion criteria to improve recruitment, revised schedule of events for better clarity for the study coordinator, added additional lab analysis on blood samples that were already collected per the protocol, or an accelerated dose escalation plan. And I would agree with the majority of you. I would answer D. And as I'm thinking through this question, I'm really trying to consider which of these changes would potentially present the most risk for the patients. And if there's some possibility of concern for the safety of patients, then you would want to allow FDA adequate time to review and comment with any concerns that they have. So the next thing that we'll discuss in terms of IND maintenance is information amendments. So these information amendments are any amendment to an IND application with information essential to the product that doesn't fall within the scope of a protocol amendment, a safety report, or an annual report. So it's kind of a catch-all category of submission. These amendments should be submitted as needed, but if possible, FDA has requested that you try not to submit them more than once every 30 days. Information amendments are categorized based on the type of information that is included in the submission. For example, there are amendments for chemistry, microbiology, pharmacology, toxicology, clinical safety, statistics, and clinical pharmacology. So as an example, if there is a change to product manufacturing after the IND has already gone into effect, then updated information on the manufacturing process could be provided as an information amendment in the chemistry section. Now, per the regulations, any information amendment submitted under an IND application is required to bear identification of its contents in the cover letter. So an example of that language is provided here on the slide. And if the sponsor desires direct FDA feedback on the information amendment, they can include those specific questions in the cover letter of their submission. And your amendment should also contain a statement of the purpose as well as an organized submission of any data, just to ensure the most efficient review by FDA. There are two kinds of IND safety reports, an initial written report or a follow-up to a written report. So IND sponsors are responsible for promptly reviewing all available information relevant to the safety of the drug to determine if the information meets the criteria for a safety report. These IND safety reports should be submitted for serious, unexpected adverse reactions that are associated with the use of the study drug. Additionally, any clinically relevant increase in the occurrence or the suspected, or the, any increase in the occurrence of a serious suspected adverse reaction that's associated with the drug should be reported here. So findings from other studies in animal or in vitro testing that suggest a significant risk in humans will also need to be submitted to FDA in a safety report. Any other relevant information that doesn't meet these criteria can simply be submitted as an information amendment or included in the annual report. The definition of an adverse event is any untoward medical occurrence associated with the use of a drug in humans, whether or not that event is considered to be drug related. I really like this diagram here, which was found on FDA's website, because it highlights that a large number of adverse events can occur within the context of a clinical investigation, but only a small subset of these are possibly related to the study drug. And an even smaller subset can actually be classified as an adverse reaction to that drug. To clarify which types of adverse events meet the criteria for an IND safety report, I'm going to walk through the definitions of adverse events that are serious, unexpected, and associated with the use of a study drug. An adverse event is considered to be associated with the use of a study drug if there is a reasonable possibility that the drug caused the adverse event. So in this definition, reasonable possibility simply means that there is some evidence to suggest a causal relationship between the drug and the adverse event. And it's the sponsor's responsibility to evaluate the available evidence and make that judgment call. The sponsor can even overrule the investigator's assessment here. Now, a serious adverse event is defined as an event occurring at any dose that, in the view of either the investigator or the sponsor, meets or results in one of the following outcomes: death, a life-threatening situation, inpatient hospitalization or prolongation of existing hospitalization, a persistent or significant disability or incapacity, or a congenital anomaly or birth defect. Additionally, other medical events can be considered serious if they jeopardize the subject and require medical or surgical intervention in order to prevent one of the outcomes listed above. Examples of such medical events would include things like allergic reactions requiring intensive treatment. An adverse event is considered unexpected if the specificity or severity of the event is not consistent with the current investigator brochure. Now, I mentioned that not all IND submissions need to include an investigator's brochure. So if you don't have one for your study, then it would be considered unexpected if the specificity or severity isn't consistent with the risk information that you included in your IND application. And anytime new adverse event information is received, it is the sponsor's responsibility to determine if the event meets this definition of being unexpected for the purposes of safety reporting. If it's determined that the adverse event meets this criteria for a written IND safety report, the sponsor must also submit the report to FDA within specific timelines based on the type of information being reported. So these can be categorized as 7-day reports, 15-day reports, and follow-up reports. Safety reports for unexpected fatal or life-threatening adverse reactions will need to be reported as soon as possible, but no later than 7 days after the sponsor's initial receipt of the information. If it's an unexpected serious adverse reaction that's not fatal or life-threatening, then you can report that within 15 days. And if there are new findings suggesting significant risk to humans from other sources, then this can also be submitted in that 15-day window. Any additional information that you obtain from a previously submitted safety report can be submitted as a follow-up safety report as soon as the information is available, but no later than 15 calendar days. And these safety reports are most often submitted in the form of Form 3500A, which is referred to as the MedWatch form for mandatory reporting. And these reports should include a brief narrative describing the adverse event and any other relevant information. The IND safety report should also identify all previous safety reports that were previously submitted to the IND concerning similar adverse events and analyze the significance of these adverse events in light of the previous reports. If the sponsor holds multiple INDs for this particular drug, then the safety report will need to be submitted to all of the sponsor's INDs. So we have a couple of case scenarios coming up, and I'll read through them, but as I'm reading through, I want you to be thinking about whether or not this event that's described is serious, unexpected, associated with the drug, and depending on the answers to those questions, whether or not you would submit it as a safety report or in an annual report. So in this example, we have a drug Danielera, which is being injected intramuscularly every week for 3 months. During the second month, a subject reports peripheral numbness and tingling. The patient is discontinued from treatment and stays in the study for safety follow-up. After 2 months of follow-up, the numbness has not resolved or improved. The investigator did not characterize the event as life-threatening, but evaluated it as probably related to Danielera. The investigator's brochure indicates that Danielera can cause peripheral numbness that resolves within a few days. So the first question is this event serious? So this is a somewhat tricky question, and we're not physicians here, so we would be deferring the final judgment to the physician. But in the case of this example, we are considering that this would be a serious event because it could be considered a persistent or significant disability or incapacity due to the fact that the numbness lasted for several months. Is this event unexpected based on the information in the Daniel Era investigator's brochure? So I agree with most of you here. I would answer yes. Based on the brochure, they said that the numbness was expected to be short-lived, so this would count as a greater severity than what was described in the initial brochure. So we would say that it's unexpected. Is this event related to the study drug? So I agree here, and we're really just relying simply on the investigator's statement. So they did say that this was probably related, so we would answer yes. So based on all of those questions, how and when would you report this event to the FDA? It looks like most people are answering B, and I would agree with that. So this was a serious unexpected event, and it was associated with the study drug, so it would qualify for a 15-day safety report. Now, if the reporting, what would the reporting timeline be if the numbness became widespread and led to difficulty breathing, which became life-threatening? So it looks like everyone is getting this correct. Because the event now becomes life-threatening, this would up the timeline. So you would now have seven days from the time of receipt of information to report this to FDA. Okay, we have a second case scenario here. So a study subject is receiving investigational drug Oracanib to treat a soft tissue sarcoma. The subject was prescribed pain medicine as part of their standard of care, and they decided to double the pain medicine dose. That evening, the subject became lightheaded, fainted, and was admitted to the ICU, where she was diagnosed with hypotension. She received treatment for that and was released the next day. Hypotension is not listed in the investigator's brochure for Oracanib. The reporting physician assessed the event as likely related to an overdose of her pain medicine and not related to Oracanib. So would you consider this event to be serious? So I agree here. I would consider this to be serious because the patient needed to be hospitalized. Is the event unexpected based on the information that's provided in the Oracanib IB? So yes, if you remember back to the summary, it was stated that that hypertension was not included in the brochure. Is this event related to the study drug? Again, it looks like most of you are getting this correct, so I would answer no. The physician said that it was likely related to the pain medicine overdose, but not to the study drug. So we would say that it's not related here. So given that, how and when would you report this event to the FDA? So it looks like there's some split between the answers here. I would say that you should report this as an IND annual report. So we know that it was serious and unexpected, but we said that it wasn't related to the study drug. So therefore, it doesn't meet the requirement for a study report in real time, but it can be submitted to the FDA later. So finally, we will discuss the end of your IND. An IND can be withdrawn by the sponsor for any reason, including the completion of your study. This is a permanent change, and the IND cannot be reactivated after it's been withdrawn. So if the IND is withdrawn for safety reasons, then the IRB will also need to be notified of withdrawal. As an alternative to withdrawal, the IND could also be given an inactive status, and this is initiated either by the sponsor or the FDA. So from FDA's perspective, they may inactivate the IND if no subjects have been entered into clinical studies in 2 years, or if the investigation remains on clinical hold for over a year. If the IND is inactive, the sponsor is not required to submit an annual report, and it may be reactivated by submitting a protocol amendment. INDs that are inactive for over 5 years, however, are at risk for being terminated by the FDA. And termination is typically based on safety issues, but it could also be based on other deficiencies in the IND or in the conduct of the investigation. But if FDA is thinking about terminating your study, you will usually have a chance to respond and communicate with them about this. So in the last couple of minutes, I'll try to quickly go over some slides on expanded access. Expanded access is defined as the use of an investigational drug outside of the scope of clinical investigation for treatment purposes. It may also be used for an approved drug if the availability of that drug has been limited. So expanded access is also commonly referred to as compassionate use or treatment use, and the primary goal here is treatment as opposed to research. Expanded access is generally considered when enrollment in an ongoing clinical trial is not possible. So FDA's specific requirements for expanded access are that the patient needs to have a serious and immediately life-threatening condition with no satisfactory alternative treatments. The potential benefit from the expanded access has to justify the risks, and those potential risks cannot be considered unreasonable in the context of the patient situation. Lastly, the expanded access cannot interfere with ongoing clinical investigations to support marketing approval. The investigator must also have approval from the drug company as well as the IRB in order to use a drug through this expanded access pathway. There are several broad categories of expanded access. For example, it can be used for individual patients. It can be used for intermediate-sized patient populations. So this is common if you're using the drug for an indication where it's not currently being developed. Third, you could have expanded access for a large patient population. This is commonly referred to as a treatment IND or protocol. And with this type of expanded access, it may be relevant if the sponsor is actively pursuing marketing approval of the drug for that particular use. So in this case, there should already be sufficient clinical evidence of safety and effectiveness of the drug. And this kind of expanded access would basically be acting as a bridge between the end of your clinical studies for the drug and the marketing approval, where it can be readily available to patients. Any of these requests can be submitted as either a new IND to the FDA or as a protocol under an existing IND. So the type of expanded access request that you submit will dictate when treatment of your patient can begin. In an emergency situation, treatment can begin with only verbal authorization from the FDA. But if it's a non-emergent individual patient or intermediate-sized patient population request that was submitted to an existing IND, treatments can begin immediately after the submission to FDA. If these same requests are submitted as a separate standalone IND, then you would need to wait the normal 30 days for FDA to review before you can give the drug for treatment. And then all treatment INDs, whether they're submitted as a separate IND or as a protocol, will require you to wait 30 days from submission to begin. So lastly, I want to highlight that for individual patient expanded access, Form 1571, which is included in all INDs, was seen as overly complicated and a poor fit for physicians that are requesting individual patient access. So Form 3926 was created to simplify this process for requesting access for individual patients. And it's thought to reduce the time commitment as well as the number of attachments that need to go in. However, you still do need to provide a letter of authorization and possibly the informed consent document. So that brings us to the end of part 2, and I definitely want to thank all of you for taking time to attend this IND workshop. I'm happy to take any questions now, but you're also welcome to contact us at orac@duke.edu. And as I've tried to highlight throughout the talk, we do have a lot of great resources on our website. So we have a number of templates that you might find helpful, as well as recordings of past seminars that could be of interest to you. And before you drop off, I also wanted to highlight that when you close out of WebEx, there should be an evaluation survey that will pop up in Poll Everywhere. So if you have a minute to complete that and give us any feedback, we would greatly appreciate that. Thanks again.
Thanks, Catherine. I know we're basically at overtime anyway, so I've tried to respond to everyone's questions. So yeah, I think as Catherine said, just reach out if you have specific questions, and we'll try to, the slides should be available in WebEx. I know people are asking about that and emailing, but we may send them out by email to everyone who attended as well. And the recordings should be on our website next week if you want to listen again. So thank you for participating, and thanks, Catherine.
Thanks.